I'm Sean, and I'm going to talk about the autonomic nervous system. I'm just going to basically talk about the general layout and structure and function of the autonomic nervous system. So I want to start out here by talking a little bit about the actual neuronal circuitry that you can basically generalize for the rest of the nervous system. There are a couple of exceptions, which I may talk about later. So I have shown here a purple neuron here. This would be the soma, or the cell body of the neuron. Then radiating out from it are the dendrites. And then this is the presynaptic neuron is what it's called. When you're talking about the autonomic nervous system, that means this neuron here, of these two neurons. The target organ is at the end. That's the organ that's actually affected. A lot of times this is smooth muscle, but sometimes it's other kinds of cells within the organ. This is the postsynaptic neuron in red here, and this receives the signal from the presynaptic neuron, and then it transmits that signal using whatever neurotransmitter it uses to the target organ. Now, if we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system, the neurotransmitter used is acetylcholine for the presynaptic neuron. This is the same, though, also for the parasympathetic division of the nervous system, for this presynaptic neuron. So this is actually the same for both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. It releases acetylcholine, and acetylcholine binds to nicotininergic receptors. There are a vast variety of nicotine receptors because they have multiple subunits, which I may get into a little bit later in another video, but there's quite a variety of nicotine receptors. There's also what are called muscarinic receptors. These can actually be found also in the sympathetic nervous system, but they're pretty much mostly used in the parasympathetic nervous system. And so acetylcholine binds to both nicotininergic and muscarinic receptors. And I might talk a little bit later about that in this video. So this postsynaptic neuron here is receiving a signal via acetylcholine, but depending on whether it's in the parasympathetic or the sympathetic nervous system, what it releases here will vary. So in the case of the parasympathetic nervous system, this neuron also releases acetylcholine, just like the presynaptic neuron, okay? But in the case of the sympathetic nervous system, these are adrenergic neurons, which means they release, or actually I should say noradrenergic neurons, because they actually release norepinephrine instead of just epinephrine. Epinephrine is mostly released from the adrenal medulla here, where I have the pointer on the kidney, but in the case of actual neurons that's in the sympathetic nervous system, they use norepinephrine. However, they also have exceptions. Sometimes they release what are called neuropeptides, which are actually protein molecules. These other molecules, like acetylcholine and norepinephrine, are not amino acid molecules. So, in a case of a protein, that's a complicated polymer of different amino acids that make up a structure, just like machinery in the cell. So if you think about it, there's probably multiple substrates that those combine to compared to just one molecule. And it's more of a specific interaction with another protein probably, because there's multiple contact points that could hydrogen bond. So this would be the target organ here. Now, the cell bodies of neurons are rather small compared to the actual axon, and areas that have groups of cell bodies, or somas, are called ganglia, if they're in the periphery outside of the central nervous system. If they're within the central nervous system, they're called nuclei, and if they're in the brain. If they're actually in the spinal cord, they can be called, like in this case of the autonomic nervous system, they can be found in the intermediolateral cell column, which I did talk about in a previous video, but that is actually basically in the middle, if you're on the ventral dorsal axis of the spine, and then all the way lateral. There's actually, they kind of bulge out a little bit in your spine. Okay? Also, let's talk very briefly about the receptors. In the case of the parasympathetic nervous system, I'm just going to basically talk about the postsynaptic neuron because they both use the cholinergic presynaptic neuron. So in the case of the postsynaptic neuron here, this could have, in the case of the where the target organ is, if it's a parasympathetic neuron, typically the receptors that are receiving the signal are going to be muscarinic receptors, and you actually have 5 muscarinic receptors. You have 5 of them, and I'm not sure about nicotininergic receptors in the target organs for the parasympathetic nervous system, which also receive acetylcholine, but I believe it's mostly just muscarinic. Now, in the case of the sympathetic nervous system, we have what are called adrenergic receptors. We have alpha receptors, and we have 2 of those, 2 kinds. Actually, 2 divisions, but actually each division has 3 variants, or maybe 3 splice variants. So actually, that's actually 6. And then in the case of the beta receptor, there's 3 of those that we know about right now. I don't know about splice variants, but I believe there's just basically 3 of those. There's beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. Okay? So if I was just going to summarize the receptors, I just want to basically tell you that the muscarinic receptors, if this is the best way to remember it, if they're an odd number, like 1, 3, or 5, then those use GQ signaling. So if you want to read about G protein coupled receptors, you can read about that. But basically, once the substrate binds to the actual G protein coupled receptor, there's a G protein. If it's the GQ version, that GQ activates phospholipase C. Phospholipase C creates diacylglycerol, which stays in the membrane, and then what's called IP3, which is inositol triphosphate, and then that goes down, and well, it probably signals other things, but one of the major ones that it signals is the IP3 receptor, which is in the endoplasmic reticulum or the sarcoplasmic reticulum maybe. When it binds to that, it triggers the release of calcium into the cell. Then that activates protein kinase C, or at least translocates protein kinase C to the membrane. And then diacylglycerol activates protein kinase C, a lot of versions of protein kinase C. And then protein kinase C can activate other pathways. The second messenger, calcium, it's a cation. It's an actual divalent cation, which means it's very positively charged. It diffuses through the cell very fast, and it signals different processes. Now, in the case of smooth muscle, that calcium is going to activate pathways that cause smooth muscle contraction. So if it's if it's 1, 3, or 5, it causes. That's why they call it muscarinic. It causes contraction of the smooth muscle through, I think, CAMK2, it basically activates the myosin light chain kinase, and then activates your contraction in smooth muscle. That causes contraction. Now, if it's an even number, if it's 2 or 4, in the case of the M receptors, then it's going to actually activate what's called the GI pathway, which that's a G protein, and that's inhibitory towards adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase produces cyclic AMP, and so if you're inhibiting cyclic AMP, then you're inhibiting protein, you're not really activating protein kinase A anymore, and that has downstream effects that basically antagonize the protein kinase A pathway in cells. In the case of the adrenergic receptors here, the alpha, we just talked about GQ, right? For the odd numbers, the alpha 1s 1 receptors do the same thing as this here, the 1, 3, and 5. They activate GQ, phospholipase C, that causes the release of calcium, activates protein kinase C. In the case of the alpha 2 receptor, that does the same thing as the even numbers here for G protein coupler receptors, and that activates the inhibitory, that inhibits cyclic AMP, that also activates GI, the inhibitory G protein, and can also cause opening, I believe, opening of the potassium channel, and that's also the case, I believe, for the muscarinic 2,4 receptors, which when you open up potassium, you cause hyperpolarization of the cell, and that makes the cell less excitable, probably antagonizes activation. Okay, so I talked about alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, 2, and 3. Beta 1 and 2 are both stimulatory. That's GS. They're stimulatory towards adenylate cyclase, which means they activate protein kinase A, and in activating protein kinase A, if it's smooth muscle, actually protein kinase A, when it phosphorylates the myosin light chain kinase, it actually causes an inhibition, which actually causes inhibition of contraction of smooth muscle. So actually beta 1 and 2 are actually anti-contractile for smooth muscle. So, but they do have other effects. So beta blockers actually do block these, but there's other effects on the heart that are desirable for, and that's why they use beta blockers, which I might get into in a different video. Beta 3, you can find in your adipocytes. I believe that's also stimulatory, so that's also GS, I believe, and that one actually causes an increase in the rate of the breakdown of fat, basically lysing your fatty acids, or causing fatty acids, breaking down your triglycerides and your adipocytes, which is one reason why having your sympathetic nervous system going a lot is going to cause you to burn more fat. So, yeah, that's a brief overview of just the cellular level for the autonomic nervous system. Now I want to get a little bit to the larger scope here. So, on the left here, I've drawn just parts of the brainstem. The green is the thalamus. This is the hypothalamus here in the middle, which is actually ventral to the thalamus here, a little bit towards the front, somewhere up in here. And then below that is this part that's brown, that's dipping down from it. That's your pituitary gland, which secretes, I think, 5 or 6 hormones. It secretes some of the relevant ones to what I'm going to talk about today. The relevant one would probably be vasopressin if I get to it here. This other part that's purple and orange here, this would be your actual midbrain. So your midbrain has different functions, including it also affects your dopaminergic signaling up in the higher parts of your brain. Has a lot of different functions. There's also a tectum in the back, and you have your quadrigemini. So you have your superior colliculus and your inferior colliculus on each side, which help with reflexes in response to hearing, and also control where your eyes go and stuff. So this green part here would be your pyramidal neurons coming down. I have it shown so it's cut here so you can actually see the midbrain, but this green part would be the stream of information coming down from your primary motor cortex, and some of them come from your premotor cortex and go down to your lower motor neurons, which control your muscles down your spine. Okay. This purple part here, this would be the pons if it's more bulged here, which interacts with the cerebellum, which I don't have shown here. But the pons also has other nuclei that affect the autonomic nervous system and other parts of your brain. I'm not going to get into nuclei that much here. Below it here is what's called the medulla oblongata, and that includes different nuclei like the dorsal motor nucleus, the nucleus ambiguus. Those control the branches of the parasympathetic nervous system through the vagus nerve. the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve is actually the main nucleus that controls that has projections down that go through the vagus nerve into your body. The sympathetic nervous system is controlled by the hypothalamus, but I don't know a whole bunch about where it goes near medulla, and I don't know how much is actually known about it, but eventually it gets down to the different levels of your spine and the different spinal segments. So this green part in your the first spinal basically division here would be your cervical division, and it has 8 segments from it, and I believe 8 basically nerves that come out, spinal nerves, but I think there's a change somewhere in here where one's above the other. I can't remember exactly right now, but there are 8 divisions or 8 segments here. Then your thoracic division has 12, and then your lumbar segment has 5, and then your sacral segment has 5, and then you have your little lonely coccygeal one down here. So that's 1. It's a total, I think, of 31, possibly 31 or 32 or 30. So this segment here does have some some spinal nerves that go to this area here. This is just for the sympathetic nervous system right here. This is called your sympathetic chain ganglia. It's also called the perivertebral ganglia. And here you have spinal nerves that are coming from the intermediolateral cell column that I was talking about earlier. And they go here, they either synapse here, and then synapse with the postsynaptic neuron that I was talking about earlier, and then go to your target organ, or in some cases, especially with the sympathetic nervous system, simply because the sympathetic nervous system has its cell bodies coming from the intermediolateral cell column, from all the way from up here down to there, and I think even in your sacral segments possibly. So basically those sometimes can go through the sympathetic chain ganglia and go all the way down to like a ganglia or a plexus, so when it binds there, it binds the postsynaptic neuron that goes to the directly to the organ, right? The ones that actually go through and don't stop in the sympathetic chain ganglia, those are called splanchnic nerves. So, and those are mostly sympathetic. However, there are some, well actually when I think about it, probably all of the parasympathetic nerves, spinal nerves, are basically splanchnic nerves. Anyway, so then moving down, you have the thoracic area, then you have the lumbar region, which mostly serves like your legs. And this region here, this is the sacral segment, and this serves like basically your pelvic region, like your genitals, the bladder, and your large intestine, your colon, like your sigmoid colon here, and rectal areas. Whereas this other area here, in the case of the parasympathetic nervous system, is connected to the vagus nerve along with all the other organs that are connected to the parasympathetic nervous system. That comes from this blue one here that I'm talking about here. It goes and serves these different organs. So now I'm just going to probably go from top to bottom here. I have like 9 more minutes, so I'll try to get through this pretty quick. So this is cranial nerve 3, and it comes from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus in I believe that's might be in the midbrain or pons area somewhere, probably the midbrain, and that follows the oculomotor cranial nerve, and that goes to your eyeball there. So it actually controls the constriction or dilation of your pupil. In the case of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is this actual nerve that I'm talking about here, that causes constriction of your pupil. This is the ciliary ganglion. This is where the preganglionic meets the postganglionic neuron, and the postganglionic neuron secretes acetylcholine, and that causes contraction of your iris. Okay. And this would be your facial nerve here. That comes from the medulla oblongata. That goes and that serves the lachrymal gland. We're talking about the parasympathetic nervous system here, which causes secretion of tears from your lacrimal gland, and that goes down basically into your nasal area by your eye here. And also some of it goes through your nose, I think, and then some of it causes tears to be secreted here. And also your facial nerve, cranial nerve 7, also serves your submandibular and sublingual saliva glands and causes secretion of saliva, especially of the actual fluid, because it's still vasodilated unless the sympathetic nervous system takes over. Now, in the case of the sympathetic nervous system activation of either of these glands here, the sympathetic nervous system causes vasodilation using the alpha-1 receptors that I showed you earlier. And when it does that, that causes less fluid to be secreted and more protein to be secreted from all these glands. Okay. The parasympathetic nervous system basically activates ion channels through the GQ pathway through calcium. Those ion channels, basically the end result is secretion of sodium and chloride into the lumen of your saliva ducts, and then water flows through, takes a paracellular route and I think also a transcellular route, and it fills up your ducts, and then some of those ions are pumped back across, but the end result is a secretion of fluid. And like I said, the sympathetic nervous system, I believe, activates, actually I don't remember, it causes protein secretion from those cells. Moving down, down to the next level here, 9, cranial nerve 9 actually serves the palatine, your parotid saliva glands, and this is the otic ganglion. This is the pterygopalatine ganglion that serves the This is the submandibular ganglion, and the one that serves your palatine saliva, or the parotid saliva gland. This one is the otic ganglion, which is near your ear somewhere. I think this is the pterygopalatine ganglion that serves your lacrimal gland from your parasympathetics. I have blue as the parasympathetic nervous system here. Okay. The same thing is true with the case of saliva, more protein secretion, but more vasoconstriction, so less protein secretion. Or more protein secretion, but less liquid secretion, okay? So moving on to this is the vagus nerve here. The vagus nerve serves a lot of your body here. It's cranial nerve 10, illustrated by a Roman numeral. So this would be your pulmonary plexus. The vagus nerve goes into that pulmonary plexus, and it causes bronchoconstriction, which is because of contraction of smooth muscle in your bronchi, which results in a reduction in the cross-sectional surface area of your bronchi. So less air moves through, but I think in that case, though, you have there's a higher likelihood of mucus being able to move up and out of your lungs. But in the case of asthma, that's very severe, and that can cause you basically not be able to breathe, which is a bad thing. However, your sympathetic nervous system also innervates this, and this comes from areas, I think, in the first 5 segments of your thoracic segments here. That secretes norepinephrine instead of the acetylcholine at the end target organ there, which is the smooth muscle. That causes stimulation of adenylate cyclase, which eventually basically results in relaxation of your bronchial smooth muscle, possibly opening calcium channels, etc. So that helps you breathe better. That's why they use an EpiPen, epinephrine, which actually doesn't really act as much on your alpha-1 receptors. So that actually mostly causes relaxation. Whereas in the case of norepinephrine, that's more likely to cause for any alpha-1 receptors, which you may not have a lot of up here, but if you had alpha-1 receptors, that would be more likely to cause contraction if it's norepinephrine. So, but that's why they use an EpiPen, which is just epinephrine. But in the case of norepinephrine, because it's beta 1 receptors, that's actually going to cause smooth muscle relaxation. So that's that. Moving down to the heart, areas, segments 1 through 5 are your thoracic segments. Those serve either through splanchnic nerves or through the sympathetic chain ganglia. Eventually what ends up going to your heart here, it goes up to the superior cervical ganglion. This area serves areas in your brain, areas in your face, etc. that are sympathetic, that are from your sympathetic nervous system. But it also serves your heart. So that goes to your heart, that goes to, some of them go to the cardiac plexus or go through the cardiac plexus. Your vagus nerve also innervates the cardiac plexus. So you have parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation going through there. The red here would be from your superior cervical ganglion, and that does two things. If it's the sympathetic nervous system, it increases what's called chronotropy, which is the rate at which your sinoatrial node sends out a pulse, and then that activates the atrioventricular node, which is in your right atrium, and then that signals through the Purkinje cells, basically eventually through the Purkinje cells, causes contraction of your heart. So basically it can increase chronotropy and ionotropy. Ionotropy is basically how much your cardiomyocytes contract, and that's by modulating calcium signaling, by activating phospholambin, your L-type calcium channels, and basically increasing the function of pumping calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, making it happen faster, and increasing how much calcium is released. So it increases, increases lusotropy, which is how quickly you recover, which I was just talking about SERCA, which is your endoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase. So if it pumps it in faster, you can also relax faster, which allows the heart to stretch more and then pump harder. So that increases your stroke volume and your cardiac output. I have to stop now in the video, but I will continue here in the next video. Thank you.